Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. Today is day 47, and we have a pretty useful little topic today. How do you decline names in Russian? Well, names are basically nouns. By the way, some of them are adjectives, so more on that in a moment. But let's start with names that are basically nouns. As we might expect, most male names are going to be basically like masculine nouns. Most feminine names are going to be basically like feminine nouns, right? So there's nothing too unusual here. Let's look first at a poster. Выше знамя Маркса, Энгельса, Ленина и Сталина, right? So there we have genitives, right, of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin. And we see, of course, that Lenin and Stalin, by the way, which were not their real names, as you probably know, but anyway, they are traditional Russian names in the sense that most traditional last names end in "ov" or "in," right? So Lenin, Stalin, those are Russian names. Obviously, Marx and Engels aren't, but since they happen to end in a consonant and refer to men, then they're very easily just declined as though they were ordinary masculine animate nouns, right? So let's look over a table here and we see basically what we would expect, right? Let's start with the female name like Marina Ivanovna Tsvetaeva, right? I've chosen some authors. We'll read her work in the spring in book two. So we see that Marina, the first name, is basically just a feminine noun, nothing unusual whatsoever. The patronymic, the отчество, Ivanovna, nothing whatsoever unusual here, right? It looks just like a noun, a feminine noun. But the last name, look at the black boxes. We see that in some cases, actually in 4 of the 6 cases, feminine last names take what looks like an adjectival ending, right? So Tsvetaeva is the nominative. If we say we're reading Tsvetaeva, we'd need the accusative. We'd say Tsvetaevu. Okay, that's logical. But all the other forms, we get oi, 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 right? Which corresponds to the adjectival endings for those cases. Okay, so that's a bit of an exception. So try to isolate those examples there and think generally, okay, female names act just like nouns. We've got to be on guard with last names. And in every case except for nominative and accusative, we get oi, 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 oi. Okay, what about male names? If we look those over, we see there's only one exception with male names, right? Mikhail is a typical first name. It looks like a noun, masculine animate noun, right? Note, of course, that the accusative is Mikhaila, right? Looks like the genitive because this is an animate noun, basically. Afanasievich is a male patronymic. Отчество also looks like a masculine animate noun. And that leaves the last name, Bulgakov, Bulgakova, etc. We see what look like noun endings, except for the instrumental, right? We get Bulgakovim, right, which looks like an adjectival ending, right? So, for example, it's not Bulgakovom. That would be the typical mistake, right? Bulgakovum, but instead of that we get Bulgakovim. Okay, so these endings here, again, they're pretty easy if we just remember the exceptions. These would work, at least, especially in terms of the last name. These would apply to any traditional Russian last name that ends in ov or in or the female equivalent of that. Now, actually, I misspoke a little bit. One exception is if you have traditional Russian names ending in where the in is stressed, right? So let's start with a masculine example, right, with no ending. We have in, that in suffix, and the in is stressed. Okay, names like that, last names like that, are going to be basically in stressed nouns. Okay, that's really all there is to know about them. That's the only sense in which they're weird. So let's take, for example, the brilliant Russian literary theorist and philosopher and did a little bit of everything, Bakhtin. If you haven't read him, I highly recommend checking him out. He's one of my favorite Russian authors. Anyway, Bakhtin. Okay, so look what we're dealing with. Bakhtin. So compare that, for example, to Putin, right? Putin ends in, but the stress is on the first syllable, Putin, right? Or Lenin. Here we have Bakhtin, right? The stress on the in. Okay, so in all the other cases, when we add any ending, the ending is going to be stressed. Bakhtina, Bakhtina, Bakhtinu, Bakhtinim. There's that funny ending. Okay, what if he had a woman in his family right? We get the female version of the same thing, and again, all the endings would be stressed. Bakhtina, bakhtinoi, bakhtinu, etc. Okay, so watch out for that little trick. Not a whole lot of names like that, but again, it's worth watching out for. Another example would be the composer Borodin. Borodin, right? So if you're listening to Borodin, that would be мы слушаем Borodina, Borodina. Okay, we know already that a lot of Russian last names are adjectives, right? They're going to end in ski, right? And so remember our old rule, once an adjective, always an adjective. If you have a last name that's an adjective, it takes adjectival endings, and those are the only endings it can ever take, right? So look at the male example, Mayakovsky. Remember, that's going to be treated like a masculine animate, so the accusative would be Mayakovskava, just like the genitive. Dative Mayakovskamu, prepositional a Mayakovskam, right, about Mayakovsky, etc., right? So we're getting adjectival endings. Again, if there were a woman in, I'm just giving that same example just to be clear, right? If there were a woman in his family, she would be Mayakovskaya, right? She would take feminine adjectival endings throughout. Keep in mind that some adjectives like this are in-stressed. An example is Tolstoy, right? Those would decline just like Bolshoi, right? Like an in-stressed adjective. But again, the major point is that these are all adjectival. Okay, let's play this game just a little bit with adjectival names. A lot of subway stations are named after famous people. And since here the noun we're referring to is stanция, right? It's actually a feminine noun. So we say that Mayakovsky station or whatever. We're going to say not Mayakovsky, but we're going to make that basically feminine, right? So that it can modify stanция. So this is obviously some very useful grammar if you're in Petersburg or Moscow. You're going to be taking the subway all the time. And so Mayakovsky station will be Mayakovskaya, right? Stanция Mayakovskaya. Dostoevsky station will be Dostoevskaya, Stanция Dostoevskaya. Chekhov station will be Chekhovskaya, Chekhovskaya, right? We're supplying, we need to make an adjective out of Chekhov, right? And so we add ski, right? Chekhovskaya. Pushkin station will be Pushkinskaya. Chernyshevskaya will be Chernyshevsky will give us Chernyshevskaya, Chernyshevsky station. Mendeleev, right, will be Mendeleevskaya. And one that's a bit of an exception, Gorky, right, the writer, that station is Gorkovskaya, right? So we use a slightly different suffix there, Gorkovskaya. Okay, what about other male names? And this would include not only Russian names that don't follow the traditional pattern of ending in ov or in, right? So this could be Russian names like Pasternak, Mandelstam, right? We can think of maybe some famous writers whose names don't end in, and we're talking about last name. Well, Russian last names, right? They don't end in or ov, right? Well, they're going to act just like masculine nouns, right? With no exceptions. Right, so we look over Pasternak, for example, we see no exception, not even in the instrumental, right? So it's Pasternakam and not Pasternakim or something, right? What about foreign names? Well, let's take Barack Obama, right? Okay, so referring to a male, if the name, it could be first name, last name, any name whatsoever. If it happens to end in a consonant like Barack, then it'll be treated like a masculine animate, right? With no funny business whatsoever. If it happens to end in an a or a ya, then it's going to be treated like a masculine noun with feminine endings, right? So Obama, the accusative would be Obamu, right? Just like it would be with Papa or Dядя, right? So Obama would be considered a masculine noun, if it refers to a male person, but it has feminine endings, right? So it's declined like a feminine noun. Okay, so if a male name happens to end in something else, like what if it's an Italian name and ends in an or, right, or a Spanish name? Then, as we might predict, it's going to be indeclinable, just like any other foreign word like that, like a noun ending in or, like metro, or a city like Helsinki that ends in an e, or some other noun, some other vowel that really can't work as a feminine or a masculine noun. So, for example, Я видел Барака Обаму. Okay, there's an accusative. Я читаю Edgar Poe. We're reading Edgar Allan Poe, right? Who's quite well known in Russia, right? So Edgar, that first name works as a masculine, but Poe is indeclinable. Pablo Picasso, right? Well, both names ending in O, that's going to be indeclinable across the board, right? Я люблю Pablo Picasso. And this is a film of Federico Fellini, right? At the film genitive, but we get no change to the form, right? Federica Fellini. What about female names, right? Especially foreign female names, or even Russian names, right? Like let's take first a foreign name, Hillary Clinton. Okay, Hillary is going to be indeclinable no matter what we're talking about. Clinton would work fine if it referred to a male, right? Like Bill Clinton, then we would get the full declension. But since here Clinton refers to a woman, it would be a little bit weird to decline that like a masculine noun if it refers to a woman, right? That just doesn't really, and so they don't. It's basically just for whatever reason, it's left indeclined. Not undeclined, right? So I saw Hillary Clinton, that's accusative, but we get no change to those forms. Hillary Clinton, right? What about, we mentioned Mandelstam earlier, the Russian poet, a male poet. His wife was Nadyezhda. Okay, so what are we going to do with her name? Well, her first name, Nadyezhda, that's a feminine name. It's a feminine noun, so no question there. Mandelstam happens to end in a consonant, right? It's not a traditional name in or ov, or I should say a typical Russian last name. So it's also in decline. Мы читаем Надежду Мандельштам. Another foreign name, I love Nicole Kidman. Okay, they're both of her names, right? The first one looks like a soft masculine. Her last name looks like a hard masculine. But because these names refer to a woman, we don't decline them, right? Я люблю Nicole Kidman. Okay, let's say we're reading some authors, and some of these are Russian, some are foreign, right? So we need to think how to conjugate these. And again, most of these are pretty straightforward. Мы читаем Bulgakova, right? Remember that these are male, they're going to be animate, which is important, right? Because they're going to look like genitive forms. Bulgakova, Pushkina, Bakhtina, there's that stress shift. Bakhtina, Akhmatova, okay, that's feminine, so we're reading Akhmatovu, right, accusative. Mayakovsky is adjectival, so мы читаем Mayakovskого. Мы читаем Gipius. Okay, that's a somewhat unusual name. It's a feminine last name, but it ends in it's the name of a female, but it ends in a consonant, so we're not going to decline that. And we'll read Gipius. She's an important Silver Age poet. We'll read her in book 2. So мы читаем Gipius. We're reading Tolstaya. She's not as well known as Tolstoy, the very famous novelist. She's a more recent author, but at any rate, basically the female version of Tolstoy. Tolstaya, we're reading her. Мы читаем Толстую. Мы читаем Tsvetayevu. Pasternak, right? Pasternak, just treated like an animate noun, masculine. Gorkova, Толстого, Solzhenitsina, Platonova, Nabokova, right? All these masculine names. Ulitskую, that's a feminine adjective, Ulitskую. Okay, now a couple of foreign names. Shakespeare, okay, that's treated like an animate masculine, no problem. Shakespeare. Jane Austen, however, right? Obviously a woman's name, but it turns out in Russian looking like two masculine nouns, so we're going to leave those undeclined, right? Мы читаем Jane Austen. And finally, Dostoevsky, another adjective. Мы читаем Dostoevskого. Okay, let's get some full names just for practice, right? Имя, отчество, familia, name, patronymic, last name. We're reading Мы читаем Анну Андреевну Ахматову. Okay, so just keep in mind that the first name and patronymics, those are all acting like nouns. There's no funny business at all. Мы читаем Владимира Владимировича right? And you might pick your favorite author and think about, are we going to decline it or not in Russian? Let's practice some dative forms, right? We say that in Russian we have a monument to someone using the dative, so fairly common. You're walking around town, you see all these monuments everywhere, especially to writers. Okay, so это памятник кому, right? So let's just supply the dative. Это памятник Александру Сергеевичу Пушкину. Number two, это памятник Николаю, soft, Васильевичу, hard, Gogolю, again, soft. Three, this is a monument to Akhmatova. Now we've got to watch out for this feminine last name, right? It's in a dative, it's going to look like an adjective. Это памятник Анне Андреевне Akhmatovой. We're going to talk a lot about that monument in book 2, and we're going to learn basically exactly why it looks the way it does. It's very, very symbolic, the pose we see there. We'll find out where she's looking also, which is rather haunting. Okay, number 4, the monument to Dostoevsky in front of the Lenin Library in Moscow. Это памятник Федору Михайловичу Достоевскому. That whole little square there in front of the Lenin Library was being remodeled last time I was in Moscow. That would have been in 2019. I'm interested to see what it looks like now. Okay, anyway, so Dostoevsky is again an adjective, so we get Dostoevskomu. Пять, a monument to Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy. This is in Tula, his hometown. At least his estate is not far from Tula, right outside Tula. And the little joke there is that he's actually walking toward what used to be a vodka factory. Recently, they've remodeled it into kind of a little hipster haven with little cafes and workspaces and whatnot. But anyway, that was the old joke. He's headed straight for the vodka factory. Okay, so anyway, это памятник Lvu Nikolaevичу Толстому. Right, Lev, the yeah there is a mobile vowel. And again, Tolstoy is an adjective. Number 6, a monument to Glinka. Okay, a male composer, but his last name looks like a feminine noun. Это памятник Михаилу Ивановичу Глинке. 7, to Lenin. Это памятник Владимиру Ильичу Ленину. Ilyich, that's an interest noun, right, his patronymic, and that was kind of one of his nicknames. He was referred to quite a bit in Soviet times simply as Ilyich. Okay, Voisyam, this is a monument to the Empress Ekaterina II, Catherine II, also known as Catherine the Great. Это памятник императрице Екатерине II. Вторая there being an adjective, right? Императрице Екатерине II. A monument to Mayakovsky in Moscow. Это памятник Владимиру Владимировичу Маяковскому. 10, a monument to Pushkin and his wife, right? In their disastrously ill-fated marriage, which ended up getting him killed in a duel. Это памятник Александру Пушкину и Наталье Гончаровой. Again, her last name there is acting like an adjective, right? Unusual. Number 11, a couple of weird monuments in Petersburg. First, the monument to the nose of Major Kovalyov. You'll have to read Gogol's short story, The Nose, to figure that out. Anyway, это памятник носу майора Kovalyova. Right, so only nosu changes, that's the dative. And a monument to the good dog, Gavrusha. Это памятник доброй собаке Gavrusha. Okay, let's use a few genitives, right? If we say we're reading a novel, of someone in Russian, we say in English a novel by someone, but in Russian we could say things like War and Peace is a novel of Tolstoy. So here we're giving genitives. Война и мир, роман Толстого, да, это роман Толстого. Нос, это рассказ Гоголя, right? We could throw in an это here, it's not necessary, but we're basically explaining what these things are, almost giving a definition, right? Requiem – это поэма Akhmatovой. Akhmatovой. I think I left out the это here just to leave room for the blank. Dostoevsky, Idiot – это роман Dostoevskого, right? The Idiot. Number 5, 5. Двое – это стихотворение Цветаевой, right? The two, and we'll read this poem in the spring, is a poem of Tsvetaeva. Again, we get that adjectival ending oi. Мы это роман антиутопия, right, a dystopian novel by Zamyatin. We'll read an excerpt from that in book two. Послушайте, это стихотворение Маяковского. It's a poem of Mayakovsky. And finally, The Vulture, Korshun, это стихотворение Bloka. So all of the poems mentioned here we'll read in the spring. Again, if they're poems. We won't be reading War and Peace in the spring. That is in book two, I mean to say. Right, Mayakovsky says, "Мы требуем мира, но если тронете," right? We demand peace, but if you touch us, and you see there the quote is attributed to Mayakovsky. Okay, let's give some datives, right? Let's give these things to. Well, actually, we have different cases here. The first one is dative. Give this magazine to Irina Pavlovna. Okay, so if we're being polite, referring to these people very politely, we would use first name and patronymic. Remember that all of these are acting like ordinary nouns. That's really important to remember. Otherwise, you can get confused in all these exceptions, right? First name, patronymic, those are all acting like ordinary masculine and feminine nouns. Дайте этот журнал Ирине Павловне, пожалуйста. Will you see Maria Sergeyevna today? Okay, that'll be accusative. Вы сегодня увидите Марию Сергеевну? Tomorrow we will meet with Anna Ivanovna in a restaurant. Мы завтра встретимся с, right, instrumental, с Анной Ивановной в ресторане. Will you help Ivan Alexandrovich write this article? Okay, helping, that requires the dative. Вы не поможете Ивану Александровичу написать эту статью? Oleg Sergeyevich, do you really not remember good old Oleg Sergeyevich? Неужели вы не помните Олега Сергеевича? Right, accusative, looks like genitive. We with Sergei Mikhailovich, meaning Sergei Mikhailovich and I, were at the theater yesterday. Мы с Сергеем Михайловичем были вчера в театре. Right, they were writing Yem with Mikhailovich because of the 5-letter spelling rule. Okay, let's ask if these writers knew each other, and I'll give you the answer to that question. So here, of course, we need instrumental, and we have to watch out for that, especially with masculine last names. That's the only exception, right? With those traditional or most typical Russian last names in ov or in. Tolstoy был знаком с Chekhovim. Да, right? We see a photograph of that in the book, right? Of course, they knew each other. Dostoevsky был знаком с Толстым. Нет, right? Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, a little fun fact, they never met, even though they were contemporaries and two of the most important writers, certainly of their period. They never met each other. Number 3, they read each other, certainly, and respected each other's work, for sure. 3, did Pasternak, was he acquainted with Tsvetaeva? Pasternak был знаком с Tsvetaevой? Да. Yes, they were. They had a long correspondence and dedicated poems to each other. We'll read one of those. A poem, for example, that Tsvetaeva dedicated to Pasternak, we'll read in book 2. Did Pushkin know Gogol? Pushkin был знаком с Gogolем? Да. Yes, they met each other. Pushkin was not acquainted with Lermontov, however. Lermontov never met his idol, Pushkin. Right, that leads us to number 5. Lermontov был знаком с Pushkiным? Нет. Right, and again, Pushkin is a traditional last name, or typical last name in Ian, so we get that unusual adjectival ending in the instrumental. 6. Was Akhmatova acquainted with Gumilyov? Akhmatova была знакома с Гумилевым? Да, I'll say they were married to each other for a while, and they got divorced, and Gumilyov was executed by the Bolsheviks, and we'll talk all about that in book 2. Gumilyov was also a very important poet in his own right, although not as prominent as, at least certainly not now, as Akhmatova. Okay, number 7. Was Blok acquainted with Andrei Biely? Right, Blok, a symbolist poet. Andrei Biely, also a symbolist poet, although now he's best known for his novel Petersburg, which is a wonderful novel. It doesn't translate too well. Anyway, Blok был знаком с Андреем Белым. Да, yes, they knew each other, and indeed, Biele had an affair with Bloch's wife. They had kind of this weird love triangle, which was quite typical of the rather decadent morals of these symbolist figures. Anyway, okay, one last thing today. Again, traditional, just typical Russian first names all have a standard, at least one standard, what we might call short forms, right? So sometimes people mistakenly think of these as diminutives. They're not really diminutives. There are diminutive forms of these, but we're going to talk about those later, I think in book 3. But anyway, so if you know someone named Mikhail, for example, and you address them using ty, right? You address them informally, they're friends of yours. You would almost never call them Mikhail. You would call them by again the standard short form of whatever their name is. Misha, Borya, Dasha, Yulia, right? So here we have just 4 examples of again standard short forms of these Russian names, male and female. Now, keep in mind, of course, that friends will often think of nicknames for each other. They may also use diminutive forms, which exist. But so you'll hear various things. But again, for any Russian name, you're going to have a standard name. Like Misha, for example, is not something someone made up. It's not a nickname. It's the short form of Mikhail. Okay, if we look these over, we see, in terms of how they're declined, these are all feminine endings, right? All of these short form names, even the ones referring to men, are taking feminine endings. We see some are hard, some are soft, right? Misha, Dasha are acting like hard nouns, basically. Borya and Yulia are soft, right? So, for example, Boryu, Yuliu in the accusative. Okay, so let's take a few of these, right? And I've given you the short form name and then the actual first name, right? So it can take a while to get used to all of these when you're studying Russian and start meeting Russians. I need to call Pasha, right? That will require the dative, right? Мне надо позвонить Пашу, right? Sorry. Pasha, right? Instead of Pavlu, we say Pasha, right? So we're keeping feminine endings on these short forms. I got acquainted with Masha. Я познакомился с Машей, right? The long version would be с Марией, right? I haven't seen Сережа in so long. Я так давно Сережу не видел. Right? Instead of Sergeya, we have the short form Serежу. Nastya, what did you give Nastya? Okay, that'll be dative. Что ты подарила Настя? As opposed to Анастасии. Did you receive a letter from Tanya? Ты получил письмо от Тани, as opposed to от Татьяны. Ира, are you meeting up with Ира? Ты встречаешься с Ирой или с Ириной? Right, long form. Володя called me yesterday. Володя позвонил мне вчера. Или Владимир позвонил мне вчера. Kolya, we with Kolya and I are going to the movies. Мы с Kolей идем в кино. Or мы с Николаем. That would be the long form. Ksyusha, short form of Ksenia. Let's talk about Ksyusha. Давайте поговорим о Ксюше. Or the long form would be о Ксении. Do you know Lena? Right, accusative. Ты знаешь Лену? Or ты знаешь Елену? Okay, so as you're meeting Russians, right, and let's say your friends, let's say maybe they're fellow students or young people, you would want to find out the short form, whatever their name is, and then you would use that presumably, right, when you're talking to them or talking to other friends about them, you would normally use, for example, Pasha and not Pavel, right? So again, it works out in Russian that the long form of the first name is almost never used traditionally in Russia, you would use either the short form for ty for informal, or the long form plus the patronymic for formal address, right? So the long form by itself is quite rare, actually. Although a little addendum to this: if you ever work in Russia, which I did for a couple of years in an office environment, where you have some foreigners and sometimes like our CEO was a foreigner, and we had we had a lot of foreigners working in this company, and I think for that reason, it's quite typical nowadays to simply use the long first name. So I wouldn't go up to like my boss. Actually, I did call her Ira, but we kind of knew each other, right? So it just kind of it's one of the things that of course depends on your relationship with people. But anyway, what I should say is even in semi-formal situations where it would be inappropriate to use the short form, right? That is to sort of use the, you would use the long form of the name, like Pavel, or again, if it's a foreigner, like with me, Mark, right? And so I feel like it's hard to say. This is kind of shifting, but I get the sense that in sort of formal circles nowadays in Russia, as especially when Russians are interacting with foreigners, they're tending now to use just the long form of the first name, yeah, the way we would, right? The way we would in English. So it's something to listen for and something to watch for. Okay. Anyway, that's it for today. Enough about names. Until next time, до свидания, товарищи.